Quick note before I start, if you like real-life stories about being underestimated, quiet comebacks, and life turning around, consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps, and it means a lot. Okay, here's my story. For most of my life, I was the punchline. Not the funny kind, the uncomfortable kind. The one people laughed at when they thought I couldn't hear. The one they smiled at with pity. Family, classmates, later coworkers, they all seemed to agree on one thing about me: I was never going to be anyone important. My name is Emily, I live in the USA, and growing up, I was always the slow one. That's what they called me. Not outright, of course. It came wrapped in jokes and half-smiles. Emily's just different. She means well. She's not really leadership material. Everyone laughed, and I learned early that pushing back only made it worse. At family gatherings, my cousins talked about their plans, their promotions, their big dreams. When it was my turn, someone would chuckle and say, "Emily's just taking life at her own pace." My uncle once joked that I'd probably still be figuring things out at 40. Nobody corrected him. At work, it was the same story. I was dependable, quiet, invisible. People talked over me in meetings. Ideas I suggested were ignored, until someone else repeated them louder. Then suddenly they were brilliant. I learned to shrink, to nod, to stay in my lane. What hurt most wasn't the laughter itself. It was how normal it felt to everyone else, like my role had already been decided, and questioning it would only make me look delusional. For a long time I believed them. I really did. What none of them knew, what never even crossed their minds, was that while they were busy laughing, I was paying attention. And one day, without raising my voice or announcing my intentions, I would walk back into their lives in a role they never imagined for me. As their boss. The judgment started early. So early that I didn't even recognize it as cruelty at first, it was just the air I grew up breathing. I was labeled soft before I was 10. Not in a kind way. In a she won't survive the real world way. If I cried, I was told I was too sensitive. If I stayed quiet, I was slow. If I hesitated before answering a question, people assumed I didn't understand it at all. No one waited to see if I might surprise them. At school, teachers spoke to me carefully, like I might break. Classmates finished my sentences for me. When group projects were assigned, I was given the easy tasks without discussion. I remember once trying to explain an idea and being interrupted with, "It's okay, we've got it." They didn't. At home, it was worse because it felt permanent. Relatives compared me to kids who were louder, faster, more confident. "Your cousin already knows what he wants to be," someone would say, looking right at me. Another would add, "Emily's just not wired that way." That phrase followed me everywhere. By the time I was a teenager, expectations for me were already low, and somehow that was considered kindness. No pressure, no belief, no chance to fail because no one expected success in the first place. What hurts the most looking back is how quickly I accepted it. I learned to smile when people underestimated me. I learned to nod when they spoke over me. I learned to shrink. And once people decide who you are early enough, they stop looking for proof that they might be wrong. Once a role is assigned, people rarely question it. They just reinforce it, over and over, until it feels permanent. In my case, the group decided early on that I was the slow one. The one you didn't take seriously. The one whose ideas were automatically brushed aside. And what shocked me wasn't how cruel they were individually, but how casual it all felt to them. It showed up in jokes first. Little comments that everyone laughed at, so I felt stupid for not laughing too. "Wait, you want to lead the project? Oh wow, look at her being ambitious today. Don't worry, we'll explain it again, slowly." They compared me constantly, always to someone else. Someone louder. Someone faster. Someone more confident. And every comparison landed the same way: I was lacking. I was behind. I was never quite enough. Even when I succeeded, the narrative didn't change. If I did well on a test, it was luck. If I had a good idea, someone else repeated it louder and suddenly it was brilliant. If I stayed quiet, they said I had nothing to contribute. The worst part? No one ever openly declared me inferior. They didn't need to. The group dynamic handled it for them. Eye contact. Smirks. Inside jokes I wasn't part of. Decisions made without asking me. I learned quickly that fighting it made things worse. So I adapted. I shrank. I spoke less. I started doubting my own thoughts before anyone else could, and slowly, dangerously, I began to play the role they gave me, not because it was true, but because resisting felt exhausting. They weren't just laughing at me. They were shaping who they thought I would always be. There are private wounds, and then there are the ones that happen in front of an audience. The kind that teach you shame in real time. For me, those moments were almost routine. I remember one meeting early on, a room full of people, coffee cups, notebooks, that low hum of importance everyone pretends not to care about. I had prepared. Really prepared. Notes, numbers, even a backup plan if someone pushed back. When I started speaking, I barely got 2 sentences in before someone laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. Another voice followed, "Oh wow, she's presenting?" Someone else added, "This should be interesting." I froze. My face burned. I felt every eye flick toward me, then away, like I wasn't worth the full glance. The manager didn't stop it. He smiled politely, like it was harmless. Like I was harmless. I rushed through the rest, my voice shaking, words tripping over each other. When I finished, there was silence, not thoughtful silence, but awkward, dismissive silence. Then someone said, "Let's hear from someone with more experience." That phrase stuck with me for years. It didn't only happen at work. At family gatherings, people joked about my phase of trying to be ambitious. At parties, someone would introduce me with a laugh, "She's still figuring things out." At dinners, my opinions were ignored until someone else repeated them, then they were applauded. Once, someone openly said, "You're cute when you try to sound confident." Everyone laughed. Including me. Because not laughing felt worse. Each time, I told myself not to be dramatic, that it wasn't that bad. That I was too sensitive. But humiliation has a way of stacking. One moment at a time, it teaches you to expect less, from others, and from yourself. And slowly, without anyone needing to say it out loud, I learned my place in public. I was there to be underestimated. The worst part wasn't what they said out loud. It was what their voices slowly replaced inside my head. After hearing it enough times, that I was slow, awkward, not leadership material, not that kind of person, I stopped arguing. Not with them. With myself. I began filtering my thoughts before they ever reached my mouth. Don't say that, it's probably stupid. Someone else will explain it better. Why would they listen to you? I'd sit in meetings with ideas that made sense, ideas I later watched get praised when someone else voiced them. At first, that hurt. Then it felt expected. I told myself I must have misunderstood my own thoughts. That confidence was something other people were born with. I started apologizing for everything. For asking questions. For taking up time. For existing in spaces where I didn't feel earned. When someone interrupted me, I'd stop talking completely. When someone corrected me, even gently, I assumed they were right, even when my gut said otherwise. At home, I replayed conversations obsessively. Every laugh, every sideways glance became proof that they saw me the way I feared I truly was. I'd lie awake thinking about things I said months ago, convinced I had embarrassed myself beyond repair. I lowered my goals without admitting it. Jobs I didn't apply for. Opportunities one didn't mention. I told myself I was being realistic, but really, I was protecting myself from confirmation of what I already believed. That I wasn't enough. The narrative wrapped around me so quietly I didn't notice when it became mine. I stopped dreaming out loud. I stopped introducing myself with confidence. I became smaller, emotionally, socially, mentally, because being small felt safer than being wrong. And the most dangerous part? No one had to push me down anymore. I was doing it myself. It didn't happen during a big argument or some dramatic humiliation. There was no shouting, no tears in front of anyone else. That's what surprised me most. The breaking point was quiet. I was sitting alone at my desk late one evening, staring at an email I'd rewritten at least 6 times. It was a simple suggestion. Nothing revolutionary. But my fingers hovered over the keyboard like I was about to step into traffic. I could already hear the responses in my head, the jokes, the subtle digs, the polite dismissal dressed up as feedback. And suddenly, something inside me just stopped, not exploded. Not screamed. Stopped obeying. I remember leaning back in my chair and thinking, if they think I'm incompetent no matter what I do, then I have nothing left to lose. That thought landed heavier than anger ever had. It wasn't rage, it was clarity. A calm, almost eerie clarity. I realized I had been living my life as if I were on trial, constantly trying to prove I deserved space, respect, oxygen. And the verdict had been decided long before I ever walked into the room. Their opinions weren't based on my actions, they were based on the role they'd assigned me years ago. That night, I didn't send the email. But not because I was scared. I didn't send it because I finally understood something crucial. I didn't want their validation anymore. I wanted my own. I closed my laptop and sat there in the dark, feeling something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Resolve. Not confidence, not yet. But determination. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that grows roots. I made a decision I didn't tell anyone about. I wouldn't argue my worth out loud anymore. I wouldn't correct their assumptions. I wouldn't ask for permission to change. I would do it quietly. And when the time came, I wouldn't explain myself either. That was the moment everything shifted, not in how they saw me, but in how I finally stopped seeing myself through their eyes. Nothing about my life changed on the outside at first, and that was intentional. I didn't announce goals. I didn't post progress. I didn't correct anyone when they underestimated me. I let them keep their version of me because it gave me something invaluable, invisibility. I started staying late, not to impress anyone, but to learn. I asked questions in private instead of meetings. I read contracts, reports, manuals, things no one expected me to understand. When I didn't know something, I didn't spiral anymore. I treated ignorance like a temporary condition, not a character flaw. At home, my evenings changed. Less replaying conversations. More studying, planning, rebuilding the parts of myself I'd abandoned. I listened to podcasts on leadership and psychology while cooking dinner. I took online courses under a personal email address. No applause. No accountability except my own. People still made jokes. Still talked over me. Still smiled with that familiar mix of pity and mild amusement. And for the first time, it didn't pierce me the same way. Their words started to feel outdated. Like commentary from people who hadn't read the latest chapter. Progress was slow and lonely. There were nights I wanted to tell someone, I'm not who you think I am anymore. But I didn't. I remembered how easily confidence had been used against me before. Silence felt safer. Stronger. The strangest part was how addictive the process became. Improving without witnesses, succeeding without permission. Failing privately and adjusting without shame. I wasn't trying to prove them wrong. I was building a version of myself that didn't require their agreement to exist. And day by day, quietly, the gap between who they thought I was and who I was becoming grew wider. As I changed, something else happened almost naturally. I stepped back. Not dramatically. I didn't cut anyone off or make announcements about boundaries. I just stopped offering myself up for judgment. I spoke less. I listened more. I declined invitations that drained me. I left conversations earlier. The space I created felt strange at first, like learning to walk with a limb you didn't know you had. From that distance, I started seeing people more clearly. I noticed who only talked when they were performing and who listened when no one was watching. I saw how quickly humor turned into hierarchy, how jokes always seemed to land on the same people. I realized how often just teasing was used as camouflage for control. I watched how the same people who dismissed me were generous with praise, just not in my direction. How competence was celebrated when it came from the right person. How mistakes were forgiven selectively. And I noticed something unsettling: no matter what I did differently, they reacted the same. Which confirmed what I'd suspected: their behavior had never been about me. It was about maintaining a familiar order where everyone stayed in their assigned place. That understanding brought a quiet relief. I stopped personalizing every slight. Instead of asking, "What did I do wrong?" I asked, "What does this reveal about them?" Distance sharpened my vision. I stopped romanticizing people who benefited from my self-doubt. I stopped explaining myself to those committed to misunderstanding me. I didn't feel superior. I felt awake. Observing instead of absorbing gave me back control over my emotions. And in that calm, detached space, I began to realize something important: the version of me they underestimated no longer existed. They just hadn't caught up yet. And I was in no rush to correct them. What surprised me wasn't that they kept mocking me. It was how automatic it was. No matter how prepared I was, no matter how smoothly I handled situations, they interacted with me like nothing had changed. Comments came out on reflex, like muscle memory. "Are you sure you've got this? Let's have someone else double-check. Don't worry, we'll explain it later." Sometimes they laughed before I even finished speaking, as if the punchline was simply me trying. And the strangest part? When I did perform well, it created this brief, uncomfortable pause, followed by silence, or a subject change, or credit subtly shifting to someone else. Success didn't correct their perception, it threatened it. I realized then that improvement doesn't always update other people's opinions. Sometimes it exposes how invested they are in keeping you small. They still told the same old stories about me, outdated, exaggerated, frozen in time. Stories where I was clueless, awkward, harmless. I listened without interrupting. Without defending myself. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it no longer defined me. Inside, something had changed. Their words didn't echo the same way anymore. They hit a surface that had hardened. I stopped hoping they'd notice my growth. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. Mockery loses its power when it's no longer accurate, and when you no longer need permission to be proud of yourself. They thought they were reminding me who I was. In reality, they were showing me how far ahead I'd moved, without them even realizing it. And I understood then: when people refuse to see your evolution, it's often because accepting it would force them to confront their own stagnation. The opportunity didn't arrive with fireworks or a dramatic announcement. It came quietly, almost accidentally, the way real turning points often do. A senior manager from another department reached out after a project I'd worked on behind the scenes gained unexpected attention. I hadn't presented it. I hadn't been in the spotlight. But my name was on the data, and someone had actually read it. Thoroughly. We met for coffee outside the office, neutral ground. He asked questions, real ones. Not traps. Not tests. Questions that assumed competence instead of waiting for failure. For the first time in a long while, I felt my shoulders drop as I spoke. A few weeks later, he offered me a role on a new team. Different structure. Different expectations. More responsibility, and more autonomy. It was the kind of position I would have talked myself out of applying for a year earlier. I said yes before fear could catch up. The shift was immediate. The environment was sharper, faster, more demanding, but also fair. Feedback was direct. Mistakes were addressed without humiliation. Effort mattered. Results mattered more. And something clicked. Without the constant background noise of being underestimated, I moved differently. I spoke clearly. I made decisions. I trusted my judgment. The work didn't feel like a performance anymore, it felt like alignment. Within months, my trajectory changed. Promotions came faster than I expected. My confidence grew not from praise, but from consistency, from delivering again and again, without needing to convince anyone of my worth. I didn't tell the people who had mocked me. I didn't update my status or drop hints. I just kept moving. Because I finally understood something essential: the right environment doesn't just reveal your potential, it accelerates it. And I had found mine. They didn't find out because I told them. They found out because the hierarchy changed. It happened during a cross-department meeting, one of those formal, calendar-blocked sessions everyone suddenly takes seriously. I walked in without thinking much of it, focused on the agenda, notes already highlighted. I took a seat near the front, opened my laptop, and waited. Then the director cleared his throat and said my name. He introduced me not as support, not as background, not as someone helping out, but as the lead. The decision maker. The person approvals would now go through. I felt the shift before I saw it. Chairs adjusted. Eyes lifted. Confusion rippled across faces that had memorized a different version of me. Someone laughed reflexively, then stopped when no one joined in. Another person checked the meeting invite, as if there'd been a mistake. There wasn't. As I spoke, I kept my voice steady. No edge. No triumph. Just clarity. Authority without apology. The same people who once interrupted me now took notes. The ones who used to explain things slowly asked for confirmation. I didn't gloat. I didn't reference the past. But I saw it land. After the meeting, the energy was off. Polite smiles stretched too tight. Compliments felt rehearsed. Questions suddenly came wrapped in respect. They were recalculating. The most revealing part wasn't the silence, it was the speed at which they adjusted. How quickly mockery turned into professionalism, how easily they accepted the new reality once it was undeniable. In that moment, I felt something close to sadness. Not for them, for the years I spent believing their version of me. Because the truth was clear now, I had always been capable. They just never imagined someone like me could outrank them. And now, there was no pretending otherwise. At first, they laughed. Not a real laugh, the kind that slips out when your brain refuses to accept new information. One of them actually said, "Wait, you," like it was a punchline someone forgot to finish. Another smiled too widely and joked that there must have been a mix-up, that maybe I was covering for someone senior. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. As the minutes passed and reality didn't bend to their comfort, the laughter faded. Questions started coming, careful, indirect ones. How long has this been your role? Is this temporary? Who made that decision? Each question was really the same one: how did this happen without us noticing? Then came the panic, thinly disguised as professionalism. Emails followed. Messages phrased as congratulations but dripping with disbelief. Sudden friendliness from people who hadn't said my name in years unless it was followed by a joke. One person even pulled me aside and said, "Wow, this is so unexpected, good for you," as if success was something that had happened to me by accident. And then, inevitably, the downplaying began. They framed it as luck. Timing. Being in the right place. Someone said I'd probably had a lot of help. Another implied that the role sounded bigger than it really was. I recognized the pattern instantly: if they couldn't deny my position, they would shrink it. What struck me most wasn't the disrespect. It was the fear. They weren't angry. They weren't offended. They were unsettled, because the version of me they'd relied on, the quiet one, the easy target, the safe comparison, was gone. And that meant the story they'd been telling themselves about who deserved power was suddenly unstable. I watched them scramble to adjust their tone, their posture, their assumptions. And for the first time I understood something clearly and without bitterness: their disbelief had never been about my ability. It had been about their need to believe people like me stayed beneath people like them. That belief was gone now. And they didn't know what to replace it with. The role reversal didn't feel dramatic. It felt precise. Conversations changed first. People paused before speaking to me now, choosing their words carefully. The same voices that once talked over me started asking, "What do you think?" and actually waited for the answer. Decisions that used to be made without me were suddenly routed through my inbox. I noticed how eye contact lingered longer. How jokes disappeared. How opinions softened into questions. And I noticed myself, too. I didn't rush to fill silences anymore. I didn't over-explain or soften my authority with nervous smiles. I spoke when it mattered. I listened when it didn't. The power shift wasn't about control, it was about gravity. People leaned in because they had to. What surprised me most was how ordinary it felt once I was inside it. Not intoxicating. Not vengeful. Just aligned. Like I had finally stepped into a room built to my actual size instead of crouching in spaces that required me to shrink. Some people tested the change. Old habits flared up, subtle interruptions, sideways comments. But now, consequences existed. A raised eyebrow. A redirected agenda. A decision made without consulting them. Nothing personal. Just structure. And that's when it hit me, power doesn't need to announce itself. It simply rearranges the room around it. I didn't need to remind anyone of the past. They remembered it for me. I saw it in their restraint, in the way they recalibrated their behavior mid-sentence. The dynamic had flipped, not because I demanded it, but because reality had. And standing there, watching them adapt, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Peace. Because for the first time I wasn't reacting to how others treated me. I was setting the tone. And they were following. What surprised them most wasn't that I had authority. It was how little I needed to prove it. I didn't bring up old jokes. I didn't reference past slights. I didn't let my voice sharpen or my posture harden in quiet revenge. I showed up prepared, consistent, and fair, the same way I had always wanted someone else to be with me. When decisions needed to be made, I made them cleanly. When mistakes happened, I addressed them without humiliation. I gave credit where it was due, even to people who had never done the same for me. And somehow, that unsettled them more than anger ever could, 'cause there was nothing to fight. They waited for resentment. For ego. For payback disguised as leadership. Instead, they got boundaries. Structure. Accountability. I saw it in their faces, the slow realization that I wasn't here to rewrite the past. I was here to build something better. That I didn't need their apology to move forward, and I didn't need their approval to stay grounded. There's a particular kind of victory that doesn't make noise. It doesn't spike your heart rate or demand an audience. It feels steady. Quiet. Earned. Like standing on solid ground after years of balancing on uneven surfaces. Leading with dignity wasn't a performance. It was a choice, one I made for myself, not for them. And in that calm, something powerful happened. I stopped measuring my success against their opinion. I didn't need them to feel small. I needed to feel whole. And I finally did. For a long time, I thought the goal was to prove them wrong. To make them see me. To hear the moment their opinions cracked and turned into regret. But standing here now, I understand how small that goal really was. The real victory wasn't becoming their boss. It was becoming someone who no longer needed their validation. Being underestimated changes you. It teaches you to doubt your instincts, to shrink your voice, to confuse humility with invisibility. And if you're not careful, you'll start living a life built around other people's expectations instead of your own potential. What saved me wasn't anger or revenge. It was quiet self-respect. I learned to stop announcing my dreams to people who benefited from my fear. I learned that growth doesn't require permission. And I learned that the opinions that hurt us most are often the ones that were never qualified to begin with. If you're reading this and you've been laughed at, dismissed, or labeled before you ever had a chance to evolve, believe this, you don't owe anyone an explanation for who you're becoming. Work in silence if you need to. Change in private. Build something so solid that when the truth finally shows itself, it doesn't need defending. And when that moment comes, when they finally realize who you are, don't gloat. Just stand tall. The calm confidence of someone who knows their worth will always speak louder than the loudest doubts ever did. Sometimes, the best response to being underestimated is living well beyond what they imagined possible.